Dr. Steve Grcevich. I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist and the president of the board of directors at Key Ministry. And I am very grateful that Jeremy Collins and the folks from Pajama Conference graciously invited me to come back this year to share with you folks. We're going to talk a little bit today about the topic of putting square pegs into round holes, and specifically looking at some of the challenges that parents and churches face when helping kids who have Asperger's disorder and other social disabilities to grow spiritually. Now, as we get started in terms of thinking about this topic, there are a few general observations I'd like to make. The first one is that, God created all of us to be different, and God created some kids to be more different than He did others. And so I have to assume that He had some purpose in that, and that He was intentional about that. And when we think that there are more kids in this generation who are being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders, particularly kids on the higher end of the autism spectrum, I have to think that He has some sort of purpose in mind for that. I think that one of the things that's also important for us to be aware of, that churches are very social institutions. For example, our family has attended church for the last 10 years at a place called Fellowship. We talk about discipleship. We talk about having a relationship with Jesus Christ. So churches are very social and relational places. And so that there's a unique set of challenges that occur when we're trying to disciple kids who have challenges in terms of intuitively picking up on some of the social nuances that the rest of us would take for granted. Third, I think it's important for us to consider that we organize our worship environments on what I would call a reverse 80-20 principle. In that, in church world, one of the things that we talk about is that typically 20% of the people involved in a church do 80% of the work. Well, we create our environments to fit the 80% of folks who would be, what would be called in the autism world neurotypical. In the world that I deal with as a child psychiatrist with kids with a number of different types of hidden disabilities, we know that roughly 20% of kids have some significant emotional, behavioral, or developmental issue that's going to cause them difficulty in functioning on a day-to-day basis. And I think that we have to be aware of the fact that there is this very large segment of the population, if you're looking at 20% of kids overall, and again, that this is more than 20% of families, because if you look at the number of folks who are ultimately impacted, it's significant, where they may have a child who has a hard time doing church in the kinds of environments that we've created that work for everybody else. So I want us to keep that thought in mind and just kind of ponder that as we discuss a little bit about kids who have some difficulty socially. Then the one other thing that I think that we have to consider, like when you think about the teaching of Jesus, and He talks about the notion of the lost sheep, that Jesus went after the one while protecting the other 99. And I don't think that it's good enough for us to just say, well, we're going to do what we do as church, and your child needs to fit, like it or not, and if it doesn't work, tough. We're called to make disciples of people of all nations, and all nations in our current culture and our current environment includes kids who have differences in terms of how they learn and how they interact with each other. So that with that said, just to give you a very brief understanding of what we're talking about when it comes to Asperger's disorder, that these are kids who would meet all of the classical definitions of autism in terms of having significant disability in terms of dealing with day-to-day social cues and social relationships. They have difficulty in terms of having very restricted or narrow patterns of interest or activity. But what's unique about them is that these are kids who don't have the delays in terms of cognitive development or language development that most people associate with kids on the autism spectrum. Now, there are a couple of other terms that you'll hear bandied about as well. The notion of kids who have what we would call pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, where they would have the significant functional impairment associated with autism, but not meet all of the formal criteria for either an autistic disorder or for Asperger's. For example, that these may be kids who have the social impairment, a normal IQ, but had specific learning disabilities or issues involving their language development where they wouldn't fit the criteria. You'll also hear another term bandied about called nonverbal learning disability. And these would be kids who would have trouble picking up on the social cues and, in terms of body language, voice inflection, posture, but typically wouldn't have the same severity of functional impairment or the very narrow areas of interest that you would see with a kid who has Asperger's disorder. Now, to give you a sense of the scope of the problem, there have been a lot of figures bandied about, but anywhere from 1 in 80 to 1 in 240 kids in the United States have been diagnosed at this point with an autism spectrum disorder. The thing that I think is important for us as church leaders to consider is that the majority of kids diagnosed with autism have normal to above average IQ. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, when they did a nationwide survey, 59% of kids with an autism diagnosis have normal intelligence and no intellectual disability. So that when you look at the resources that are out there and what folks have talked about in our field to this point in time, we think about kids with autism as having a quote-unquote special need. And there's this mental image that folks classically have in mind. The problem is that a lot of these kids aren't going to fit into the kinds of quote-unquote special needs programming, particularly self-contained programming that an individual church might develop. Their parents may not and typically will not think of them having a special need. And the kids themselves, if they're placed in learning environments with predominantly kids with intellectual disabilities, will be horrified and will do everything they can not to come back to that situation again. Another unique challenge that you get into with kids with these sorts of social disabilities is that they are very, very sensitive to being bullied. And the two reasons for that are that, one, they stand out as being different, and as a result, other kids tend to pick on them more than they would oftentimes their peers. And secondly, the way that these kids react to being bullied is different. Again, the way that they respond may be less socially appropriate than, say, some of their peers, which tends to magnify the attention that they get from the kids who do the bullying. And secondly, because of the way that they're wired, they oftentimes have a harder time being able to let go of negative experiences and will perseverate on small incidents for years and years and years. I had an interesting experience recently on the autism blog for Psychology Today, reading some of the stories that the readers of the blog had detailed about how different slights and kids treating them inappropriately at church turned many of the folks writing on the blogs off to pursuing Christianity well into their adult years. So that little things that other kids might be able to blow off, or the small things that kids do on a day-to-day basis to be unkind to each other, will oftentimes have a disproportionate impact on kids who have an autism spectrum disorder or some other type of social disability. So if you think about some of the qualities that kids have who would fall into this category, we know that many of them typically, again, would have normal intelligence or way, way, way above average intelligence. So that a lot of them tend to do much better in situations interacting with adults who tend to be more forgiving of more subtle differences in terms of social communication than they would with their peers. Kids who have these types of social disabilities are much more likely to also have issues with sensory integration, so that the way that they react to loud noise, bright lights, an overstimulating environment is very, very different than kids who would be neurotypical. Kids who have Asperger's disorder or kids who have other social disabilities are significantly more likely to have issues with gross motor coordination. They tend to be clumsy, they tend to be awkward. So that if you're in a church setting where a lot of what you're doing is having kids involved with playing different types of games, I mean, these kids, are behind the 8 ball in the first place because that's something that tends not to play to their strengths. They may have difficulty being able to identify with the experiences that other people have. Statistically speaking, they're significantly more likely to also have issues with attention, concentration, organization, self-regulation on the one hand, and on the other hand, they're much more likely to have difficulties with excessive anxiety, obsessing, and perseverative thinking. Some kids will have difficulties with pragmatic language, so that you may notice that there are differences in terms of the tone in their voice, the inflection of their voice, or the volume at which they speak that make them stand out in a group with other kids. So when you consider some of these factors, and with this understanding of like some of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the kids that we work with, what are some of the challenges that you'd anticipate around church participation or spiritual development? I mean, if you think about weekend worship experiences, kids are going to have a significantly more difficult time navigating the social aspects of worship. When you think, kids who are like this have trouble oftentimes interacting with kids that they see on a daily basis for 6 hours a day at school. Kids that they see for an hour and 15 minutes, 1 hour a week, is going to be a much greater challenge. Again, with the stimulating worship environments that we try to create for our kids, oftentimes the bright lights, the loud music, the hand gestures during worship will become overwhelming to kids who have some of these relative weaknesses. When you think about what happens with other types of church activities as they get older, particularly the transition from going to elementary school to middle school or junior high ministry, where much of the ministry is done in small groups, kids with these types of social disabilities will oftentimes, again, struggle with the pure relational component of this. That if they're made fun of, if other kids in the group make inappropriate comments, they'll react differently and oftentimes get very, very turned off and be less likely to be able to work through and overcome some of those kinds of issues. If they're the victim of teasing or if they're the victim of rejection by peers. Some may also be prone to more of like what we would call all or nothing kind of thinking, where they start assuming that a couple of kids treat them this way in youth group, that this is how all Christians act, all Christians are hypocrites, therefore I don't want to have anything to do with Christ or Christianity. When it comes to spiritual disciplines, one of the challenges is that oftentimes kids who are like this are very adherent to routines and patterns, and are going to have more difficulty being able to try out or experiment with new spiritual practices, new routines. They're going to tend to be more avoidant of the spiritual disciplines that are practiced in a group, and rather withdraw to those things that one can do on a solitary basis. When you think about some of the challenges then that occur at home, that they're less likely to be interacting in different sorts of family service experiences that would be one of the strategies that many churches use to help kids to grow in faith. Church attendance may be a problem. Kids who have these types of social disabilities are more prone to have difficulty with transitions, have a harder time getting up in the morning. And because of some of the things that we're starting to learn about the genetics of these conditions, sometimes the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and kids who are like this oftentimes have parents with similar disabilities who have a hard time doing church because of the way that they're wired and the environments maybe not being as friendly or supportive of them as we would like. So some of the barriers that we got to break down is that we have to get the parents to be able to bring the kids to church. We have to think about having some environments that will work for the way that these kids are wired in terms of their social relatedness and the way that they process sensory stimulation. One of the other challenges is that we have to consider that From a developmental standpoint, oftentimes these kids have very uneven patterns of development. Certain aspects of intellectual development may be very much accelerated, whereas their social development and their motor development may be significantly delayed. So trying to pencil them into, or trying to put them into a program per se with other kids their age is the square peg oftentimes being asked to fit into the round hole. As we mentioned before, they're going to be very resistant to being placed in something labeled as a special needs ministry. And another challenge that I oftentimes encounter with kids coming through an office like mine, when I start talking to them about the possibility of doing church, is that they get to church and they end up seeing the same kids at church who are mean to them during the day and during the week when they're at school. And working through the whole issue of overcoming what they see as being the hypocrisy of other quote-unquote Christian kids is oftentimes a very big challenge. Now, one way that I think makes sense of approaching this is looking at using a family-based ministry model when we have kids who have Asperger's, PDD, or other types of social disabilities. And even though I've been doing what I do for 25 years and I took boards, I teach at a couple of different medical schools. When parents of kids, who have these complicated disabilities come into my office, I would be inclined to look to the parent as being the expert to individualize what's going to work best for their child. And particularly when it comes to spiritual development, I think that this is especially important. We tell folks, and what I tell our medical students and our fellows who rotate through our clinic and our practices, you've seen one kid with Asperger's, you've seen one kid with Asperger's. And so that it's hard to do a lot of generalizations and say that X, Y, and Z is going to work for every single kid that you encounter. So that I would view the parent as being the expert. And I think that the place for the children's ministry leader, the youth ministry leader, is to conceptualize themselves as coming alongside the parent and being able to serve as their spiritual consultant in terms of offering resources and supports that might be helpful for that particular child. I think it's important that we go ahead and look at defining what our win is when it comes to serving families with these types of disabilities. In my mind, the win occurs whenever a child or a family with a disability connects in a meaningful way with their larger family in Christ through the ministry of a local church. And so just being able to get a kid with this type of social disability in the door gives you the opportunity to be able to speak into what goes on with parents and other siblings in the family. In addition, one of the ways, if you look at some of the Orange curriculum and how Reggie Joiner's thinking can be applied here, is that these kids do well with routines. And Reggie talks about establishing a rhythm. And so that incorporating spiritual disciplines into regular routines is something that these kids may actually have an easier time being consistent with in many instances compared to kids who wouldn't have these types of disabilities. Sometimes kids, again, if they're more advanced in terms of their cognitive or intellectual development, may do better with church as a shared family experience. And they may do better in the adult worship with their parents than they would in your children's programming or your youth programming. One place where I think that we can really excel as church is creating a safe place for kids and families who are touched by Asperger's and other types of social disability to be able to encounter a safe and supportive community. And because kids with these types of disabilities oftentimes do better in terms of relating with the adults, providing them with a community of adult Christians who can model what it is to live the faith and walk the walk and talk the talk is oftentimes something that can be very helpful for them in their spiritual development. Some tips for church staff and volunteers that would be interacting with kids with Asperger's or social disabilities would be, think about the impact of the level of sensory stimulation in your environment. If you take a look at some stuff that Harmony Hensley's developed for our Church for Every Child blog, she's done some really nice posts and some nice work talking about ministry environments that are more friendly for kids who may have sensory processing issues. Partial inclusion is certainly an option for kids with these types of disabilities, so that they may be able to do part but not all of your children's program. You may want to consider having them serve for part of the time alongside different adults in your church, because, as we've shared before, oftentimes they do a lot better interacting with adults than they do with their peers. What you may want to consider, giving kids opportunities before a new experience to practice and rehearse what the experience is going to be like. Preparation is oftentimes really helpful. And little things for maybe a new kid or a new family coming to your church, or considering going on like a children's ministry retreat or some sort of a youth retreat, would be, as many pictures, as much video as you can share to give them an idea of what the experience will be like and how to prepare from a social standpoint is very beneficial. I think it's also important to look to see, well, are there some areas of potential giftedness that you can tap into with kids with these types of social disabilities? I had one boy who family was involved in a church, and he got intensely preoccupied and interested in the book of Judges. And so that, a lot of kids who are like this may have more intellectual, spiritual pursuits, helping them to get tapped into things that they may find more interesting and may fit with the way that their brain is wired, could be another way of helping them along their path to spiritual growth. Some hypothetical things that you might want to consider. There's not a whole lot of stuff out there, and certainly no research on how to best advance spiritual growth with kids with these types of social disabilities. But some of the things that I would look at would be different tangible acts of service that are modeled by parents, family members, and other adults, would be one way to promote spiritual growth. These kids have gifts and talents. If you can identify those talents and allow them to use them and see other people using them, that can counterbalance some of the stuff that they get in their peer culture in terms of being treated rudely, with disrespect, and being the target of bullying and other inappropriate types of comments and behaviors. Helping them to find an identified role in their church may be something that would be of benefit. One of the things I've observed with a lot of my kids who would have these diagnoses in our practice is that they tend to be very preoccupied with technology. I have one young guy who taught himself Japanese at the age of 5, who has learned how to reconstruct Edison's original Victrola and is looking for the recordings to play on it to see if it actually works. So that there may be a role for kids with some of these, giftedness on your tech team. Sometimes kids who have these issues may deal more easily with certain repetitive tasks. So that a kid who may be struggling in your children's ministry might do a great job at stuffing bulletins or stuffing mailings that the church has to send out. Or some older kids may be great at proofreading. We talk about the notion of trying to present the gospel to kids in an engaging way. And given the preoccupation with electronic media, I wonder if that's going to be a way that's going to open up to us in the near future. That, the kids who would find the large group worship environment with the loud music and the bright lights overstimulating might do really well with a video posted on YouTube that they're watching in their iPad to communicate the same teaching and the same truths. And that eventually that we've been beginning to plan for ways of using online ministry as a strategy for overcoming some of the discomfort that, particularly teenagers have with some of these conditions, to attending church and doing small group experiences with other kids. Now, a last comment on the whole relationship issue, because one of the things that people will classically kind of raise here is that, we talk about an evangelical church in particular, the importance of having a relationship with Jesus Christ. And I've observed other folks who have expertise in working with kids who have autism but also intellectual disabilities, where figuring out how to communicate this becomes a significant challenge. Kids who have Asperger's and kids with some of these other social disabilities, it's not an all or nothing thing, so that they're going to have some capacity to be able to grasp the concept of relationship. And so, while some may be really concrete, and the classic example of this is in children's ministry, are the kids who get confused when the leader says, well, you should invite Jesus into your heart. And they're asking you, well, how does Jesus get into my heart? What happens to my heart once Jesus is there? And they're thinking about it, oftentimes when they're younger, in a very sort of concrete, physical sort of way. It's important to keep in mind that there are other spiritual pathways. We touched on the intellectual pathway. There's also an activist pathway, a servant pathway, a contemplative pathway. There's worship. There is the creative pathway in addition to the relational pathway to God. And one of the ways that I heard this put best by one of our former board members and my previous senior pastor, Hugh Auburn, is he talked about the notion of giving as much of yourself as you can to as much of God as you can know. And I think that that's a great principle in terms of thinking about spiritual development with kids with Asperger's and other types of social disabilities. So a few final thoughts just to tie this together. Kids who are less neurotypical are likely to require more individualized approaches to spiritual growth. I think that parents, because they're the ones who know the kids best, and bear the primary responsibility for training their children in the faith, need to be the ones to take the lead, with church staff, pastors, small group leaders, and volunteers coming alongside the parents to be able to support them and offer them resources. I think with kids who would have these social disabilities, because kids who are outliers from a social standpoint may be outliers in a very strength-based way or in a very positive way in other areas, even more so than our other kids where it's critically important. I think it's important to help them to be able to identify their strengths, their gifts, their talents, and to give them opportunities through the church to be able to use them and develop those competencies. And finally, the kids that I know who would be on the quote-unquote high end of the spectrum, it's not that they're indifferent to relationship. Many of them, particularly the middle school, high school age kids, are desperate for relationships. It's just that they get hurt by other kids, they've experienced bullying, they've experienced rejection. What better place for them to be able to find acceptance and to also find the ultimate friend, than through, a caring community of peers and adults in a local church. And so I think that God has created an opportunity for us to be an incredible blessing to folks who oftentimes are marginalized in our society. So with that said, I would encourage all of you to take the time to check out the other resources that we have available at Key Ministry. Our website is www.keyministry.org. And basically, what we're set up to do is that we work with churches everywhere to help them to be able to welcome kids who have disabilities and their families. And we have a specific strength or area of interest when it comes to hidden disabilities. I'd encourage you to check out the website that I have, Church for Every Child. It's drgrcevich.wordpress.com. Katie Weatherby and Harmony Hensley from our team have wonderful blogs with lots of resources. We put on an annual conference, Inclusion Fusion, a special needs ministry Websummit that's free to pastors and church leaders around the world. And we will be developing other resources as time goes on, so please stay in touch. Jeremy will have available to you through the conference website the videos from last year's Inclusion Fusion Conference, which was attended or participated in by over 1,300 senior pastors, children's pastors, youth pastors, folks in disability ministry, volunteers, and parents. And I would definitely encourage you to check that out, as well as the free training available on inclusionfusion.org to be able to, add to whatever needs or respond to whatever needs the leaders and the volunteers in your church has, looking to serve and minister to and extend the love of Christ to kids with Asperger's, social disabilities, but any other type of hidden disability as well. Thank you for having me, and God bless.